Welcome everyone today to a presentation where we're talking about food waste, but we're also really focused on the storage of food. So storing food in a way that prevents food waste, in particular in relation to pantries and behind me a freezer. Now, did you know that pantries and freezers could be black holes where ingredients just disappear into them and only creative, clever cooks can get those ingredients back out? Well, that's not true. No, we're going to prevent that from happening in your house. And today we're going to talk about strategies and different little life hacks that'll help prevent you losing ingredients and then help prevent them from being food waste. So, well, let's go back to why. Why do we need to prevent food waste? Well, you might have seen some other presentations, the big picture and the little picture. We've got something a bit different for us to think about today. And that is we really want to prevent food waste according to this hierarchy. And the hierarchy I'm talking about is sort of like a waste stream hierarchy. I have a few little notes here to help us. So the first thing we need to think about is avoiding food waste. So let's put that one at the top of the tree, shall we? We'll put that one, stick that one up there. So we're going to avoid food waste at all costs. And you might have seen some other presentations that have encouraged you to think like that. So that might be something like Japanese pumpkin or butternut pumpkin. No waste with Japanese pumpkin, minimal waste with butternut pumpkin. So, you know, you're deciding what suits you in your household, but if you go for low waste or avoiding waste, maybe it's a change of ingredients. Okay, so working our way down our hierarchy tree, if we can't avoid food waste, then we need to reduce it. So let's pop that one in there. Okay, so if we can't avoid food waste, then we're looking to reducing it. Now, if we're going to reduce it, then maybe we're looking at strategies where we can then take, or when we're purchasing or when we're shopping, oh, that's another presentation, you must check in and see. When you're accessing your ingredients, then you think at that point, how do I reduce the amount of food waste? And maybe it is through correct storage. Maybe it's making sure that none of those use-by dates will escape your attention. Going down our hierarchy tree, we could look at reusing. So we're looking at maybe making preserves or pickles. Not sure you can see that one. Let's scoot that up. Ah, it doesn't want to be there. So we could maybe think about preserves or pickles where reapplying our leftovers, making sure that they don't get forgotten in the back of the fridge, so that avoiding food waste in that context. We could, going again further down our tree, we could repurpose. So we could make sure that, for example, our food waste ingredients might be chopped up smaller and fed to an animal, maybe a pet, or it might be something where you divide up all the food waste into certain categories and you might be able to use it as a fertiliser in the garden. Again, more about that in another presentation. I'm really encouraging you to check in some of these other presentations because I think you get the big picture of avoiding food waste. Don't just watch one of these, the big picture of avoiding food waste, which is also the big picture of why we do avoid food waste. And the last one in our food waste hierarchy is recycling. So we would be looking at perhaps composting, or we might be looking at applying some of the products that we end up not being able to use. So for example, you might have some dried bread and you might make it into breadcrumbs that feed the birds. So you're recycling, you're reusing it. So there's our waste hierarchy tree, and we've sort of turned it and squeezed it so that it fits into avoiding food waste, which is obviously the topic of today. So going back to why we're here today, so we're looking at different ways in a storage context that relate to a pantry and a freezer that we can avoid wasting food. And as we know from our big picture, little picture scenario, it's really important both to us as individuals, but also to the planet as a whole, as to why we don't waste our food, because it's so valuable in so many contexts. So we're in a lovely home today, and I'd like to thank and welcome Relma and John for having us in their home. So Relma, if you could come forward. Thank you so much, Relma, for inviting us into your house today. We've invaded with all sorts of boxes of bits and lighting and things. So, Relma, your pantry and your freezer impress me no end as to how beautifully clean and organised they are. Way superseding mine at home, I must admit. But I just have a question just to start us off. Do you organise your pantry or your freezer in a particular way?
I guess you would say it's in a set way. I like to keep the dry food up on the top shelf, and then I've got the nuts and soup making things all on the next level down, and then the next one down from that has got groceries from the grocery shop. There's things that friends have made. They've made most of the pickles I've got in there. And then the bottom shelf has got the electrical goods on it.
Yes. Excellent. I really like that, because if we just take a step back from our food, it means that you've got the heavier things down low.
That's right.
But also, back to our food, you've also got the dry things. So it means if anything does get the dribbles up, it's not going to dribble down and contaminate the things below.
No,
that's also a good thing. Excellent. Well, thank you very much for having us today. And while we will be looking and pulling things apart, we promise we'll put it back.
Okay.
Okay.
My pleasure.
You're welcome. Thank you. Okay, so let's have a look at the freezer and storage in the freezer to start with. Now, what I'd encourage you to do is to actually unpack your freezer. I know that sounds quite daunting, because some freezers are a lot bigger than Relma's. But let's have a quick look inside here. So there is still a depth to the freezer, which means that there might be things at the back that you actually miss and you don't see. So let's unpack, and we can do a little bit of a stock take. So some meat there. Looks like that might be some soup, maybe?
I think that's
Pumpkin soup, yeah. I'll close that up with a few other,
fruit.
that looks like frozen fruit, yeah, and maybe some more pumpkin soups. Nope, that's apricots, and it's labelled, which is fantastic. So when you empty out your freezer, you might find some special little items that don't have labels on them, that you don't know what they are. Maybe put those to one side would be what I encourage you to do. Maybe don't put those back into the freezer, at least not straight away. So once you've got things out of the freezer, you can have a look and see what ingredients you actually have and what ingredients you may need to reorganise. Because I'm going to give you a little philo sort of word. So what I mean when I say philo is I mean first in, last out. So, and it's quite challenging, particularly when you're unpacking the groceries after coming home from shopping, and you just want to chuck everything back in. Really what you need to do is you need to make some space behind. So if, for example, you have got 2 containers of mince, then you actually use the oldest one first. And that's really important, because you have obviously less time for the previous packet to have spent in the freezer. So try and keep that in your mind. First in, last out. All right, so put it at the back. So when you're restocking pantry or freezer, put it at the back. It'll make a big difference to how fresh your ingredients actually are. So we're unpacking the freezer, we're doing a bit of a stock take, working out what's here. Anything that you're not sure about that's dubious, put to one side. Don't necessarily put it back in. And then once you've unpacked, you might also find, and I haven't got an example of it per se, but this one here, let's say for example that the plastic packaging has come a little unstuck, and you might have come across something that's got freezer burn. So freezer burn, what happens or how that's generated is where the product has been exposed to air, and it's quite a dry air environment in a freezer, so it tends to dry out and dehydrate, and consequently it doesn't make the food bad, but it does make it a little untasty, unsavoury, maybe not so palatable. Its texture may change a little bit. If you have got some items with freezer burn, you have to make that judgment call for yourself as to how you then reapply or reuse, or if you feel like if the freezer burn's not that dramatic, you may actually decide to cook with it and maybe disguise it if you make it in a particular dish like a stew where it may not be as discernible. So up to you as to how you decide that. But any of these items, once again, everything out of the freezer, on the bench, check what you've got. If anything horrifies you, put it to one side. If anything's uncertain, put that to another side. And then you know exactly what ingredients you have in your freezer. So there's a number one action, right? Empty out the freezer to start with. And then we go to repack the freezer. So repack it, and let's think about some of Rauma's ideas where we're repacking perhaps with common ingredients together. Common ingredients in the freezer context might be all the meats stacked in together. It might be all the ingredients that you may have had pre-prepared that are ready to enter into a casserole, like I saw some of this. For example, in the door of the freezer here, we've got some packets of some tomatoes that are ready to throw into a casserole or a pasta dish. And so if you've got those ready to grab ingredients, you may group those together into your freezer as well, make them easily accessible. Think also about the packaging style. So again, plastic packaging, which you probably know by now how I feel about plastic packaging, especially when it's single use. But nonetheless, plastic packaging has usually a shorter viability than something that is a reusable plastic item, or something again which is less commonly used in a freezer is glass. Items that are glass can go in a freezer, but you need to be really conscious of the liquid that's in there, because the liquid expands when you put it in the freezer, and it can actually expand beyond the capacity of your container, making it break. Not a good look, messy, and you're wasting things. And again, that's not our mantra. That's not what we say. We don't want to waste food. So try and avoid that. So glass containers in the freezer, great with nuts. They freeze really well, but just be conscious of other items that you might put in a glass container. Plastic containers seal really well, especially in the reusable context, which we love reusable. And drips and spills can be wiped easily up from those. Single-use items, and I appreciate that when you purchase it from the supermarket or from another shopping outlet, you may have it already pre-packaged, and it's a bit of a nuisance to repack. But it might mean if you do repack, you don't get freezer burn, and you pack them in portions. So for example, the mince you can divide in half if you're buying a bulk lot, that is your portion size. So taking the extra time when you're unpacking your groceries to do that might be valid for your household. Again, I can't make that call. It's just something I'd like you to be aware of, and you can decide what works best for you. Okay, so thinking about our containers, and I just want to revisit that. I'm just going to disappear to this point here. Okay, so we have some soup here. Now, just imagine that we have heated up this soup and we've just prepared it, and we've got too much for ourselves, so we want to have some for the freezer for later. What I'd encourage you to think about is how much volume of liquid you put in your containers, and this will help prevent any spilling for later. So as I mentioned before, the liquid actually expands as you freeze it. So I would suggest that by filling the container, just so you've got a little gap at the top, it means that as that liquid freezes and does expand, it won't flow out the top. The other thing is in putting hot things straight into a freezer. I'm afraid that's a bit of a no-no. if I can throw some science at you. So what happens is, as the soup or whatever entity is quite warm, it touches the air, or there's an air lock in that particular top of the container, and that air has moisture in it. So when you introduce that moisture into that, when you introduce that container into the freezer, if it's been hot, the moisture in that air will form ice crystals. And those ice crystals often contain all sorts of living things, because the air around us does, and the moisture is part of that. So that can reintroduce a bit of contamination. So the nuts and bolts are this. When you've heated something and you want to put it in the freezer, by all means put it in the container you intend to freeze it in, but then leave the lid off slightly and let it cool to room temperature before you put it in the freezer. Huge reward. You won't get the ice crystals, no risk of further contamination, and you're going to have exactly what you put in the container come out. Big bonus. So that's important too. A lot of today's freezers have thermostats in them, which indicate whether it's running to temperature. Interesting, I know, because we've tried it. If I leave the door of that freezer open, it will beep, which we can try again, but take my word for it. So that's an indication that the temperature's falling below, probably around negative 20 degrees. Most freezers sit on around negative 20. If you can get it sort of negative 21 or 22, that's more ideal. So you need to be mindful that your freezer is running to speed. Now, so I'm just going to open the freezer and show you a couple of things to think about. So around the outside of your freezer door, and it might be a chest freezer or it might be a freezer which is a stand-up one, you'll have a seal. And that seal around there tends to be the moisture trap. A really good way of making sure that your freezer is staying to temperature is by getting a cloth and wiping all that down, keeping that incredibly clean. Because if you're going to get any fungal or mold buildup, it'll probably be there. That's sort of where that moisture trap happens. The other thing, and Ralma has this beautiful freezer that does no ice build-up at all. The other thing which can change and modify the temperature in the freezer is to have the ice build-up impacting on those seals. And when the ice builds up, it can't close the door properly to that extent. It might be so subtle that you don't actually notice it to start with, but the temperature will change in the freezer. It will also make your freezer have to run really hard to try and keep up. So keep the ice down, and you may decide when you clean out your freezer to also switch it off or chip out some extra ice. It'll give you more space that you can put your ingredients back into, and it'll also make sure that the temperature is staying at the right temperature. These are all really important things to think about, because of course we're storing our food, and if we don't store it properly, there's a strong possibility it'll be waste. And we don't necessarily want that at all. Okay, so just before we leave our freezer, I just want to talk about some labelling, and I'm going to use Ralma's perfect label here. So she has, I'm not sure, can you see that? So she's written on there apricots, and she's got a date, which is absolutely ideal. So writing on the container is one way of labelling, and there's a few mediums that work better than others. The good old Sharpie, permanent Sharpie is good, but if you're going to reuse the container, then you might decide that's sort of, you know, surplus, because you can't reuse that container without making a bit of a mess of it. So you may use, there's another product which is a dry erasable crayon. So it has a little bit of an oily base, which means in the presence of a bit of moisture, it'll still stay on there as a label. But with extra rubbing and a bit of detergent, when you've used and emptied that container, that will come off. That label texture will come off. The dry erasable crayon will come off. So it's easily removed, and just repurpose the container is really straightforward as well. You can use masking tape. There's a freezable, I think it's freezable masking tape, or something freezer-friendly masking tape or tape. By all means, if that works for you, and you can write on that and then remove the tape after you've emptied that container. I'm it feels a bit too single use for me, so I probably wouldn't encourage it. But if that suits your household, by all means, go that way. So labelling also is a great way of preventing food waste because, again, you know what's there, you know what date it was, and you know how fresh those ingredients are. All right, I think that our freezer here is a perfect example of what a freezer can look like. We'll just open again at the risk of it beeping. I just want to show you, so there's great diversity in here. We've got fantastic use of some of these clips, which mean the ingredients are not going to spill out when you've partially used those bags. You can access those clips. I think they're available at most supermarkets. And the reusable Ziploc bags, which again can be labelled as well. Some product in some containers that they were purchased in, and good old frozen banana, which is great. The only thing I would suggest is that if you're going to do your bananas, freeze your bananas, is to peel it and pop it in a container, because then you can put straight in for your smoothie or straight into your banana cake. You don't have to wait for it to defrost and get all sloppy. But otherwise, I'd like to congratulate Rama. She's done an excellent job with her freezer. So now I think we should perhaps have a look in her pantry. Now, similar to what you started with regards to auditing your freezer, let's audit your pantry. Now, I must admit, I think Ralma knew we were coming, even though, no, I'm sure it was like this regardless. It's so beautifully organised and structured that I'm too scared to bring things out of it. No, because I would know where to put them back. But nonetheless, we don't really need to. However, in your pantry at home, what I'd encourage you to do is similar to the freezer. Take things out of there, pop it on the bench so you can lay everything out ingredient-wise and see what you've got. If anything looks a little untoward or you don't expect to be using it, again, put it to one side. If you have a look at the use by dates, and let's assess what that actually means. So a use by date is a date that is definite, without a doubt, you must consume before this date. And the risk is there from a food poisoning perspective. You need to make sure that that item is consumed. Sometimes the nasty things that grow in foods you can't actually see and you can't actually smell. So you really need to abide by a use by date. But there's another date system. It's called the best before date. So if something is a best before, you need to consume it before. That's what they're referred to, then that gives you a bit of leeway, gives you a bit of flexibility. So if it says best before October, then you probably can go through and assess within reason. You're probably okay to still consume it in November. Different ingredients will have different time spans, but it gives you that flexibility. So they're saying the ideal consumption time is that date they've indicated, but there is some flexibility beyond that. And that may mean that beyond that, it loses a bit of flavour, maybe loses a bit of texture, depending on what the ingredient is. So best before and used by are very different dates. Okay, so just to reiterate the best before and the use by dates, Ralma has found something in her pantry.
I enjoy keeping my pantry fairly well stocked, but the other day I found this packet of pastry mix that's slightly out of date.
It actually says the 23rd of May 2020. So it's only, a year?
That's right.
But having said that though, and she's kept it with good reason, to be honest, because if we turn it over and have a look at the ingredients, flour, vegetable shortening, raising agents, so it hasn't got a lot of ingredients in here that could go rancid. The vegetable shortening may go rancid, but most of it would have a reasonable shelf life. So I think it's still worth giving it a go, and particularly because we're talking about preventing food waste today, we'll go that way. Thank you for sharing that with us though, because it still looks a beautiful pantry. So So you've got your pantry emptied. Now sometimes it may seem way too hard to do the whole pantry at once, so by all means do one shelf at a time and then reward yourself if it feels like it's that much of a challenge. So you've got all the bits and pieces on your bench. Now's the time to make some decisions. So some thinking like, do I group the items similar to what Relma has, where she's got dry goods, more visited goods, and perhaps something that's more shorter shelf life items, and then heavy items down the bottom? You know, do you structure it like that? Does your pantry let you structure it like that? Or alternatively, do you think about grouping ingredients that you might be commonly in need of and putting those at the forefront? So maybe you have toast and butter and jams and spreads and things every morning. So maybe that's something you need to put at the forefront. Or you could use a strategy which I have noticed in Relma's, which is pop all those sorts of ingredients in a container. So you can just grab that container out and put that on the table. It's another fantastic little idea. Makes visiting the pantry really easy. Makes you, when you're going to put your shopping list together, easily see what you need that may be your breakfast item. So that's a fantastic idea too. Or someone like me, for example, when I structure my pantry, I have mine structured with cooking ingredients. So I organise it so there's some grains and some seeds and things that can be immediately consumed. They go together on one side, which might be my breakfast, and then on the other side I've got the grains and legumes and things that need preparing. So you can organise your pantry in that way. If you have little people, then by all means think about making a shelf that suits for them. So you might incorporate that into your pantry. So you might tell them that is the shelf, or that is the space that it's okay for you to go and help yourself to things like snacks, and encourage them to be able to put spreads on their own bread or whatever it might be. That can be their shelf, so you may structure it in that way. Another way of doing it, you might actually organise your pantry so that you've got older items as opposed to the items that you're just bringing in on one side compared to the other. Whatever works for your household is the best way to do it. I have got this sitting in front of me for a reason though. And this is something that older pantries often find, is that they've got really long shelves, quite deep. Ingredients can hide. And again, we want to prevent that because there's risk of food waste. So I brought this in because this is my little repurposed Lazy Susan. So I had a Mixmaster that went to God. Rather than throwing all of the Mixmaster out, I kept the little turntable at the bottom and then got a piece of timber, drilled a hole in it, pushed the little turntable in, and now I can sit items on there, such as this little body. You can put it on the table, and here's our Lazy Susan. It's not necessarily designed for a pantry, but the same concept can be used for deep shelves in a pantry. So you could put a Lazy Susan in there so that you can access the things that are at the back simply by spinning it around. So again, it's appreciating your space and your needs of that space as to how you put all your ingredients back into the pantry. Of course, also finding ingredients that may have spilled or maybe needing a cleanup is also a really good way of preventing any contamination. So preventing ants or other little critters from coming in. If they can't access food, they'll be way less likely to come in. So that's important too. You find also that different ingredients need different things in terms of storage. So if we look down as we go down Relma's shelf, so she's got the dry storage, which is typically a cool, even temperature, and low light will be adequate for that. And most of the things in these jars as well. As we go down though, we've got some preserves, which probably would be, particularly once they're open, would be good refrigerated. And we have this beautiful loaf of bread which she made today. So in terms of bread storage, it's quite important to actually treat bread in a couple of different ways. So if it's bread that you've purchased from the supermarket, then you may find that it's got its plastic bag, and the best way to store that is limit the oxygen in it. So when you've taken a few slices out, you may suck all the air out of that before you put the little clip back on. So limiting the oxygen to that and keeping that in a low light, cool condition. If you've got bread that, as Relma has done, which is fantastic, she has made this beautiful loaf. Let's have a look. This beautiful loaf. And so being a fresh loaf, to keep that for the next couple of days, simply wrapping it in a cloth is the ideal way. So it lets a bit of air exchange, lets it breathe. If you put that in some plastic or a plastic container, even if it's slightly warm, the condensation, similar to when I was talking about the freezer, carries a few bugs and it can encourage it to become quite mouldy way before it should. So that's a great way of storing that too. As we go further down, we've got some heavy appliances, which are great at having those nice and low and accessible rather than overhead where you can grab them out and fall on your head. Never a nice thing. And from someone who's short, I get it. It happens. In my kitchen at the restaurant, it happens with the people who work who are tall. I said they've been here before and things fall on my head. Nonetheless, down the bottom down here also, she's repurposed this fantastic bread bin. John's made a lid for this, and we have potatoes and onions down in that bread bin. So that's in the darker part of the pantry to make sure that that also is in the low light, dark conditions. Again, great positioning. So a few other things. We've got our ingredients back on our, remember we've got all our ingredients on our bench, and we're just going to think about putting those back into the pantry, how to organise everything there. You need to think about making sure you've got access to the things you need really quickly. Other than that, the containers. So we talked about the freezer containers and having containers that seal really well and are multi-use, so rather than the single-use containers. And there are some fantastic organisations out there that sell you plastic containers specifically for pantries. Some of them can be quite expensive, but I tend to like using these, and I love it because Relma's using these as well. They're a 500 gram or 500 ml jar, and a few different products come in them, but you can also get them from op shops. So you can come across them really well. They wash beautifully. So they can clean up nice and sparkling. You can see what's in them and how much when you're generating your shopping list. And you can actually they stack on top of one another nicely as well if you've got that space in your pantry. So jars are a really low cost, great storage container to use for your pantry. I find plastics tend to scratch and they can sometimes absorb odours, so just be mindful of that. Otherwise, a container that seals properly is probably your best reward. All right, so just a couple more things with relation to pantries, and one of them is the good old bay tree. So some items are particularly prone to weevils, and we talked in another presentation about buying things in bulk. Now that might be a bulk purchase of flour. If you're looking at having some items in bulk, it might be rice. I would suggest that you invest in buying your own bay tree, to be honest, because, you know, like, who doesn't love a good plant? No, but irrespective of that, some bay leaves if they're dry, so don't put them in fresh as these are, but once they're dry, actually emit a camphor oil, a camphor smell, and you would be familiar with that if you've done some baking with the bay leaves. And that is a fantastic deterrent for weevils and other little critters that might get into something that you've got in bulk and you want to encourage its shelf life. So just put a couple of leaves in to help that store much more adequately. Also, reaching over here is another little thought. Let me put this on the fridge. Okay, so let's say you're from a huge big household, lots of families maybe sharing the pantry or maybe sharing the freezer. And you find it really, really tough to know what's left in there. You go to the freezer and there's no mince left. So one of the other ideas might be to actually provide yourself an ingredient log. where you have a list of some of the common ingredients. So it might be bread, meat, what else might you use? Cereal, butter, milk. And then you might list those common ingredients which tend to run out without you noticing. And you can have a countdown log. So you, instead of just simply writing how much is in there and then crossing one off when you take one out, what I'd encourage you to do is just keep a tally. So the last number is the tally. So it might be 2 loaves of bread. It might be 3 litres of milk. And then you go and buy 2 more litres of milk. So then it might be 5 litres of milk. So you just keep that tally. And then everyone encouraged to do that means you've got a fantastic little cheat sheet to take shopping with you as your shopping list. You know how much is there and how much you may need to purchase. Another great little hack. Back to our table full of all these ingredients. So what we want to do is anything that's dodgy we're putting to one side, anything that was used by dates we're not going to put back in. We repack according to some of the thoughts that we had to organise our pantry appropriately. But we're left with some items on the table, and in some ways we might be thinking, food waste. This could be food waste. Well, some things may be, but there also may be some things that you can repurpose or see if the local food bank would like them. If you're not going to use them and you feel they're not in your cooking realm or not in your ingredient preferring realm, by all means, contact the food bank and see if they'd like that tin of jalapenos you found in the back corner or that jar of mustard which is no longer being able to be used. They may be able to use it. So again, avoid that food waste. So I just want to talk a couple of things. We definitely talked about, obviously, about our freezer and our pantry, but there are other different styles of storage, particularly in relation to the pantry, you may or may not have come across, called a cool cupboard. So a cool cupboard is designed so that it has holes in the shelves, and it has usually a hole at the base of the pantry or the storage cupboard where air from below the house can work its way through. And then in the ceiling there's also a vent outside. So the idea is the cool air is circulated through up underneath the house and goes out past all your ingredients out the top. I am lucky enough to have one of these cupboards, and I store my apples and pears and a lot of fresh produce in that style of cupboard, and it works beautifully. I can store apples with no energy refrigeration for about 6 months. It's that type of storage might be something that you can move some of the ingredients from your traditional pantry to that sort of environment and have a longer shelf life. It might work in that way. So just another way of thinking. Bulk bins might be something else you'd like to incorporate into your storage of your ingredients. So they may be something like Ralma's big old bread bin, bread box, now onion and potato container, but it might also be some fantastic steel lined drawers. I also have an old house and they happen to be in there as well. So you can certainly bulk store outside of your pantry, but think about the container that you may choose to use. So there's a couple of other storage things that go beyond a traditional pantry that may be applicable to your household. Again, being informed about the options is really an important way of avoiding food waste. So let me just double check. I think we've pretty much covered most of my notes there. Consequently, I'd like to leave you with the actions, or just review and revise the actions. So when it comes to storage of your ingredients to prevent food waste, know what you have. Do an audit. Check and see if the dates are appropriate. Label if necessary. Wipe containers, wipe spills. Put everything back in an organised way so that you and perhaps whoever else is using the ingredients understands Then make sure that you've got a log or a register so that you know what is going to still be in there when you go back to visit that space. And then you can generate your shopping list from it if maybe, or if necessary, or amalgamate that with your meal plan. Come up with your shopping list between the two lists. Oh my gosh, lists again. So by doing that, then you'll have a clean, organised pantry, a clean, organised freezer, and prevent food waste, which is really what we're here all about. So thank you very much for today. Thank you for listening, and thank you also to the sponsors and to our lovely film crew. Have a great day.